Gilbert Highet, our last speaker today, who serves as a judge of the Book of the Month Club, lectures with extraordinary virtuosity, gives a weekly radio talk on subjects as widely varied as science fiction, iambic pentameters, Japanese poetry, or the art of translation, has spent most of his life studying and teaching and writing about the classics. He has taught at Oxford, and at Columbia since 1938 he has been Anton Professor of Latin Language and Literature and Executive Officer of the Department of Greek and Latin. He has translated from the Greek and written a book on Juvenal the satirist. He's done articles on Greek and Roman poetry for the Oxford Classical Dictionary and a fat, illuminating tome on the classical tradition. But strangely enough, he had never been in the land of the Latin or Greek classics until the summer of 1954, when he went to Italy and visited the Greco-Roman survivals. In his new book, Poets in a Landscape, he recreates for us the 7 great pagan poets of Rome and brings them, as one critic said, right up to our own front door. Here is Catullus, who introduced the word kiss into the language, and Virgil, who loved the soil and whose epitaph appropriately reads, poet of herdsmen, farms, and heroes. There's Propertius, who wrote only of love and Cynthia. There's Horace, the son of a slave, who became the poet laureate of Rome. For many generations, a man was not considered educated unless he knew the Horatian odes. And you remember the fable of the town mouse and the country mouse? And did you know that it is the conclusion of a Horatian poem in praise of country life as compared with city life? Tibullus, too, loved the country and women. Ovid could say wicked things in words, according to Mr. Highet, pure as sunlight. And his Metamorphoses is a veritable treasure house used throughout the ages for stories, poems, pictures, operas. And then there's Juvenal, the last of the great pagan poets. Exiled, penniless, and homeless, he could count a man lucky to be the landlord of a single lizard. Mr. Highet gives us the flavor and substance of these 7 poets, partly by numerous evocative and lovely photographs which he himself made, partly by his wide range of reference, and very largely by generous selections from their own poetry, which he translated faithfully and delightfully. I'm happy to introduce to you, as our last speaker today, a distinguished scholar who with wit, wisdom, and gaiety makes us realize that the life of the mind is an exciting thing. Gilbert Highet.
Mrs. Van Doren, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be invited to speak in such distinguished company and a pleasure to address so many lovers of books. But it contains something painful. What can I say? What is more important than the rapid and terrifying advance of science? What is a more urgent problem than the various perplexing attitudes of Russia? What can I say that would even be worth listening to after these 2 discussions? And yet, my difficulty is the difficulty of every scholar. That's what scholars have to do. A historian of law, a historian of art, an economist, a scientist. These people are all engaged in trying to resist the pressure of what seems an absolutely 100% urgent momentary crisis in order to find out and teach something which will last, something of permanent value. They all do that. That's one of their difficulties. They are constantly pulled towards participation, immediate, instant participation in what is happening in that particular month or year. And yet they feel drawn by duty towards asserting values which last. If I'm not wrong, one of Mrs. Fermi's references illustrates this. She mentioned the young Russian whom she met, Vavilov, who was, she said, the son and the grandson of president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Now, if I know anything about Vavilov, It was either his father or his grandfather who was disgraced, ruined, and exiled on a purely political, shall I say, racket. He did a great deal of admirable and fundamental research into the history of cultivated plants. But because he got across Lysenko, he was banished and, as far as I know, died in Siberia. This must be in the mind of young Vavilov. Every time he addresses a cultivated audience, every time he tries to balance himself between the pull of immediate pressures and the search for the permanent truth. That was all ad lib. An exordium is necessary, the Roman orators tell us, in order to establish a rapport and also so as to get the dryness out of one's mouth. However, it was, in fact, a legitimate preface to what I have to say. Do you ever feel, ladies and gentlemen, that the whole of your life has been spent trying to find the answer to a few fundamental questions? A few. I really do. I do. And recently, when somebody asked me why I had written some book or other, I said, in all honesty, I wrote it in order to find out what I thought about the subject. Of course, when you write a book which is meant to be informative and meant to be interesting, you do want to interest other people, and you want to tell them something which perhaps they didn't know already. But you're also settling something in your own mind. You're answering a question which has been put to you by your own life. Just 40 years ago next month, I was called into the headmaster's study in my school, aged 11. I went with fear and trembling, because our headmaster not only sounded like God and behaved like God, he looked like God. Or vice versa. MacGillivray, he gazed at me in a gloomy, thoughtful way for some time, and then he said, next autumn you are to start Greek and Latin. Go and see Mr. Buchanan, and he will tell you what books to get. Well, I said, thank you, sir, and left. I wasn't really sure whether to be proud or rebellious. I wasn't sure why he'd sent for me specially, and I was certainly not sure why I was to start Greek and Latin. In Scotland, you begin learning, or you then began learning, I don't know how far it has progressed since then, you then began learning one foreign language at the age of 11, nearly always French. And in my school, we added one more, German or Latin. But as far as I know, nobody in my school had ever taken Greek before. But I couldn't see why anybody should now. There was something awfully meaningful, too, about the way he said, you are to start Greek and Latin. Yes, but what did it mean? Well, nobody ever told me. In the fall, I started Latin and Greek as well as French. You know, that's the best time. That's the best time to learn languages. You begin about 10 or 11 or 12 at the latest. You can get anything into the heads of the young people then, before their heads are full of dreams and their emotions begin to develop. I was the only boy taking both Greek and Latin. I still remember ploughing into Homer, sitting on the drain board of the kitchen sink in an abandoned private house which had been taken over by the school for an annex. We had overcrowded schools then too. Mr. Buchanan sat gloomily opposite me on the kitchen chair. Well, I got on fairly well and fairly fast, naturally enough, because I had what amounted to private tuition in one of the languages at least. But nobody ever told me why. My father didn't know, bless his heart. He had a little Latin at his school, but he had no Greek, and he was as surprised as I was when the edict came down from heaven. Mr. Buchanan never told me, and the headmaster, it wouldn't occur to me to ask him a reason for anything. Year after year after year, I ploughed on, and so by the time I went up to college, I had been studying both Greek and Latin for 7 years, and I knew a reasonable amount of both languages. But nobody had ever told me what good it would do me, and I had scarcely been able to see for myself. Well, all freshmen are mystified. That's not dreams you see in their eyes, just mystification. But the freshman who went up to Glasgow University in 1924, he was more mystified than most. However, by this time I was 18 years old. Like many 18-year-olds, I had strong emotions. I liked music. I was starving for good music and trying to play the piano myself. I was beginning to love poetry and reading as much as I could of it and trying to write some myself. French compared with Latin and Greek, French is an easy language. I'd read a lot of French poetry. That was the beginning of my Baudelaire period. And the first sonnet I ever wrote was in French. It suffered from the fact that I didn't know how to scan French verse properly or to alternate the rhymes, but it looked very fancy. Well, suddenly in this year I began to realize one of the central reasons why I had been learning Greek and Latin. They should have told me. I think 7 years is a bit long. Still, they should have told me. It was quite simply that some of the finest poetry in the world is written in Greek and Latin and cannot, repeat, not be appreciated by anyone who doesn't know the languages themselves. This burst on me with all the force of a mystical revelation. It was as though one had been tone deaf for 7 years and suddenly learnt to hear music and appreciate a symphony. I'm quite serious. It should have occurred to me long ago, but it hadn't. Probably because schoolboys, as distinct from undergraduates, schoolboys rarely appreciate any but the simplest poetry. And perhaps because I was a little obtuse about it. Well, now I appreciated it fully, and suddenly work became a pleasure. My memory improved 400%. I learned off by heart long passages from the Greek and Roman poets, partly for their grace, partly for the grandeur of their thoughts, and partly for the sheer beauty of their sound. I still remember one of the phrases from a Greek poet which filled my mind all through one summer. Perfectly simple, from Aeschylus, the last man you'd expect. Kumaton anirithmon gelasma, the innumerable laughter of the waves of mine. And I can never forget the thrill with which I discovered, it was as though I had been the first young man who ever read the poem. I discovered the 2 lines in which Virgil, painting a picture of a peaceful countryside, actually imitates the very notes and the very rhythms of cooing wood doves and pigeons. Listen. Nec tamen interea raucae tua cura palumbes, nec gemere aerea cessabit turtur ab ulmo. I discovered that with astonishment. I said, was that there all the time? It wasn't in my annotated editions. When he wrote these wonderful lines, Virgil was only a few years younger than myself then. I thought, why not? I thought I might become a poet too. And this passionate love of the best in Greek and Latin poetry was kindled still further when I found that some of the English and French poets whom I most loved had also loved Greek and Latin, had translated some of their favourite poems from these 2 languages, and had tried, with success very often, to emulate them. Such was Swinburne, such was Tennyson, such was Keats, such was Shelley. Well, of course, you'll see the weakness in this particular approach to the classics. My professors soon did. I began to get B's instead of A's. I began to get 80% instead of 95%. And I missed a scholarship which would have meant a good deal to me. Well, nobody told me anything even yet. But now I found out for myself rather quickly. This is that there is more in Greek and Latin than poetry. There's more than the romantic poetry in particular, which I then admired. There is drama. Well, living in Scotland, I'd hardly ever seen a decent play properly performed. I was 21 years old before I ever saw Hamlet. An opera for me meant Gilbert and Sullivan. Therefore, I had a blind eye for drama. I read 4 or 5 Greek tragedies, but I couldn't envisage them as live performances, vibrating with controlled emotion. I couldn't appreciate the interplay of character on the stage and the conflict of passions. And then, equally important, there is history. One of the chief reasons why we learn Greek and Latin is to read the historians and, since they're not always reliable, what historian is, to check their statements, and then to make inferences from their accounts to the true causes which determine great political changes, the causes, mind you, which are still operative today, which may, if we understand them improperly, disturb or ruin our own lives, and which, if we analyze them properly, can illuminate at least some part of the dark future into which we are always peering. Then I knew very little about politics, and I didn't see that many of the most important phenomena in Greek and Roman history were being repeated around me within my own lifetime. The disruptive force of nationalism, the rise of empire, the pressures of personal dictatorship, the peculiarly obscure and dangerous pressures of external barbarism on a high and rather soft civilization. To understand these and other great problems, Greek and Roman history provides magnificent documents, unequaled documents, but until then I had been able to understand neither the problems nor their treatment of the Greek and Roman by the Greek and Roman writers. So gradually I went on reading, and I began to see the importance of history. Greek and Roman history, and to study it with a strange sense of familiarity as I realized the situations were reappearing through Europe and America, and I saw the same desperate efforts made to solve them. A little later, for instance, I discovered Spengler, who went very far in establishing this parallelism. You know that Spengler, writing in 1914, before the war started, the First War, he forecast that the age we live in would be, quote, the age of warring Caesarisms. The age of warring, that was calling the shots. And he made many other forecasts based on his close acquaintance with Greek and Roman history, which have been borne out or are now being borne out. Since then, we've seen Toynbee, whose entire mission as a historian began with his attempt to solve the problem of the collapse of our parent civilization. In the same way, slowly and rather painfully, I began to see how Greek drama is the origin of virtually all modern American and European drama, and how it embodied many of the finest dramatic values with which modern playwrights are still grappling. O'Neill, a new play by O'Neill was discovered yesterday, the day before. O'Neill is certainly one of the inheritors of Greek tragedy and can scarcely be understood without knowing as much Greek tragedy as he knew. On this subject, I tell you frankly, my knowledge is still very incomplete. But in a few more years, I do look forward to knowing more about that elusive art of the drama, which combines religious fervour and magical pretense, the art of the stage. And when I do, it will be from reaching a deeper understanding of the Greek playwrights. A few months later, when I went to Oxford, I began to realize there were more reasons why I'd been studying these two very difficult and sometimes infuriating languages, reasons which had been absolutely hidden from me. For the first time, I had good lecturers on Greek art. Not painting, no. Their painting was very skillful, but modern painters have far surpassed it. But their sculpture, which is unequalled for grace and naturalness, and their superb, their varied architecture, which makes so many of our own functional boxes look like temporary sheds put up to house migrants, or workshops to be inhabited by robots, but not the dwellings of human beings or the permanent sanctuaries of anything truly noble or divine. And then, even more astonishing, came the revelation of Greek philosophy and of the psychological subtleties of much Greek and Latin writing, both in fiction and in non-fiction. Quite simply, there have never been two philosophers who contributed as much to the central thought of our race as Plato and Aristotle, and there's been never any popularizer who expressed them so eloquently as Cicero. And the psychological analyses of some of Seneca's dramas, some of Plutarch's lives, which, remember, Shakespeare chose as subjects for his finest dramas, and of the histories of Tacitus and Thucydides, these psychological analyses are filled with elaborate and valuable material which is still in some ways too mature for us to explore. The final discovery was made after I'd been teaching Greek and Latin for more than 20 years, when I went to Italy for the first time and found that it was a most beautiful country, and somehow that its natural beauty had passed into the poetry and art and thought of the Roman writers, as the appearance of our grimmer and colder and less fruitful country cannot. The same may be true of Greece, I don't know. I'm looking forward to visiting it next year. So now at last, just before it's too late, I can tell myself why I started to learn Greek and Latin, and why I try to teach it to my pupils, and what I've got out of it. First, for the sense of beauty, conveyed in these two tongues, one strong and evocative, and the other vivid and versatile, and in their powerful and subtle poetry, and in their sculpture and architecture, and even their landscape. Next, the sense of history, which tells us something of the experiences of those men and women who were so like ourselves. They were more like us than the men and women of the Middle Ages, more, I think, than the men of the Renaissance. They were more like our close spiritual ancestors. The understanding of philosophy, in which their thinkers marked out most of the principal problems. An intimate acquaintance with some psychological mysteries which are still being explored and which are agonizingly important. Most of all, perhaps, what I was supposed to get from Mr. McGillivry's ukaz was a vital stimulus coming from a knowledge of the brilliant and thoughtful men who were, in many respects, the makers of our minds. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.